Rubio became the #1 target of Cuban propaganda after the dictatorship tried to turn American pressure into a fear campaign against its own people. On the morning of Tuesday, June 9, 2026, the case gained more weight because Havana's offensive against Marco Rubio appeared along with a sequence of events that weakened the regime from both inside and outside. Fake news attributed to Donald Trump about the total deportation of Cubans, attacks against Rubio in propaganda pieces with Nazi comparisons, new sanctions against names linked to the Cuban elite. Raul Castro, pressured by the United States justice system. The regime wants to present itself as resisting foreign aggression. But what appears is something else. Rubio enters this center because he is the name that bothers Havana the most within the Trump administration. He knows the Cuban machine, speaks the political language of the exiled community, and advocates a hard line against the communist leadership. That's where the dictatorship tries to twist the story, attacking those who put pressure on the regime and protecting those who control the island. What did Cuban propaganda try to do against Rubio? How did Trump and Rubio corner Havana in this new moment? I'll tell you all about it in a moment. If you like this kind of straightforward and no-nonsense content, consider subscribing because we have videos like this every day. The offensive began with the attempt to turn Marco Rubio into a public villain within the official Cuban narrative. On social media and in content linked to the regime's communication apparatus, attacks circulated against the American Secretary of State and against Donald Trump. One of the most serious points was the dissemination of alleged statements attributed to Trump about the total deportation of Cubans. Something used to spread fear among Cuban families and create the impression that Washington was against the Cuban people, not against the dictatorship. This kind of operation is simple. First, an explosive phrase is created, and in the end, the state machine uses the panic generated to say that only the regime can protect the population. Marco Rubio found himself at the center of this war because he's the political face of American pressure against Havana. The regime's reaction didn't stop at the diplomatic debate. The report circulating among Cuban journalists in exile also points to posters and messages trying to portray Rubio as a Nazi. The maneuver is harsh, but it's not new. Dictatorships usually call their opponents monsters to avoid talking about their own failures. When there's no electricity, no food, no freedom, and plenty of privilege for the elite, the regime needs to create an external enemy. Rubio became this target because he represents exactly what the Cuban leadership fears: sanctions, investigation, international exposure, and direct accountability. The problem for Havana is that recent events don't help the dictatorship's narrative. The United States Department of Justice announced in May the indictment of Raul Castro and 5 other defendants for involvement in the downing of 2 unarmed civilian aircraft belonging to the group Brothers to the Rescue in 1996. Raul Castro reappeared at an event at the Ministry of the Interior, surrounded by Cuban security figures. Meanwhile, Miguel Díaz-Canel tried to shield his image with the phrase that Raul is Cuba and that Cuba is untouchable. The scene was staged to show strength, but it also revealed fear. The Ministry of the Interior is not just any agency within the regime. It is connected to state security, internal repression, political surveillance, and population control. This message becomes even clearer with the presence of Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, known as El Cangrejo. Raul Castro's grandson, he is increasingly appearing as an important figure behind the scenes of the Cuban elite. His image with a high rank within the Ministry of the Interior fuels the interpretation that the Castro family is trying to prepare a controlled transition without handing over real power to the Cuban people. The regime talks about sovereignty, but in practice it shows a closed caste, where last name, uniform, business, and security are all mixed together. Meanwhile, the United States has stepped up the pressure on the elite. Trump imposed new sanctions against Miguel Díaz-Canel, his wife Liz Cuesta, Manuel Anido Cuesta, names linked to the Castro family, and entities associated with the regime. The pressure targets those who run the system, those who benefit from it, and those who use the state to maintain privileges. In neighborhoods of Havana and other regions, protests against the lack of electricity have resurfaced. There are reports of residents spending hours without power, without gas, and without basic conditions for a normal routine. This is the point that dismantles the official narrative. The regime tries to blame Washington for everything, but it has governed Cuba for decades. It controls the economy, controls the press, controls the police, and controls the single party. Even so, it asks for more time, more sacrifice, and more silence from the population. Diaz-Canel tries to sell the idea of economic openness, but the private sector, accepted by the dictatorship, is not truly free. What we see is a selective, protected, monitored opening, often close to figures with access to power. Independent entrepreneurs remain limited, while names connected to the elite move around with privileges. This contrast also appeared in the meeting between the Republican candidate Vic Mellor and Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro in Havana. Mellor said he took part in 2 conversations with Raul Castro's grandson and spoke about business opportunities, the future of Cuba, and economic opening. He traveled as a private citizen and candidate, not as a representative of the American government. Even so, the scene served as ammunition for an uncomfortable question. Who is authorized to talk about the island's economic future, the Cuban people, or the family circle that controls the regime's backstage? The dictatorship tries to present El Cangrejo as the face of a new face, someone capable of talking about business and change. But this image clashes with the very structure of Castroism. There is no real transition when power remains in the hands of the same family, the same party, and the same security agencies. There is no real openness when the press is controlled and citizens cannot freely choose who governs. What exists is an attempt to recycle the facade to save the system. The campaign against Rubio needs to be understood within this context. When Havana accuses, shouts, and tries to stick extreme labels on the Secretary of State, it is reacting to losing ground. The dictatorship knows that an important part of the Cuban community in the United States follows every step and demands firmness. It also knows that the narrative of revolutionary resistance is no longer as convenient as it used to be. Trump comes into this story as the president who once again put Cuba under direct pressure. His approach doesn't treat Havana as a normal government in administrative crisis, but as a communist dictatorship sustained by repression, propaganda, and economic control. This view empowers Rubio and deeply irritates the regime. That's why the propaganda tries to separate the Cuban people from American politics using fear of migration, rumors about deportation, and heavy accusations against figures in the Trump administration. The dictatorship needs the average Cuban to see Washington as a threat, because if he sees the elite itself as the problem, the official narrative, o discurso oficial desaba. The attempt to turn Rubio into a Nazi enemy shows the level of the propaganda war. It's an accusation made to shock, not to explain. It serves to produce anger, confusion, and fear, but with every exaggeration, the regime reveals its weakness. If it had economic results to show, it would show food. If it had freedom to show, it would show free elections. If it had spontaneous popular support, it wouldn't need to surround Raul Castro with uniformed personnel, security, and state ceremony. Propaganda becomes a shield when reality gets too heavy. It's the regime trying to survive while its own propaganda starts to reveal the extent of its fear. I'm Milson Alves, Global. And my purpose is to keep you well informed with the truth every day. The news links are in the video description. Leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end, check out the comments so you can stay even more engaged with the Milson Alves community.